Ryan's a forest silviculturist for the Plumas National Forest, and he's also worked for the National Park Service, UC, and for CAL FIRE. As most promising foresters in this world today are, he's got a BS and a master's in forestry from UC Berkeley. I'm just showing my biases there. So Ryan, are you on the line?
Hey, good afternoon.
Okay, well, it's all yours now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks. Bob, that was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. Gosh, tough act to follow. As well as just looking at the participant list, I know there's a lot of folks watching here today that have a tremendous amount of experience and have helped me out greatly. So thanks for the opportunity to talk. I will talk primarily about a few field experiences from the Plumas National Forest. I'll try to keep it probably less detailed. Let's see if I can start navigating here. I chose to talk about the Mount Huff Ranger District on the Plumas. You can see over the past decade or so they've had some large fires on their district. It seems like once we've finished dealing with one fire, another crops up, such as life. And so I'll present a few different fires that we've had to deal with. And there's a map of the Plumas. You can see that's a basal area mortality map showing the different types of severities, red being high and green being low. I'll sort of blast through some of this, but I thought it was worthy of mentioning, at least for the Forest Service or federal lands, NFMA, or the National Forest Management Act really sets our policy to maintain what they call appropriate forest cover in accordance with our forest plans. And we describe that in terms of species of trees, stocking, growth rates, as well as understanding that we have a multiple use sustained yield management emphasis. And then I really wanted to talk about how that relates to the field. As NFMA says, we're supposed to determine what is appropriate forest cover, and that's largely guided by our land management and resource plans, which delineate land allocation standards and guides. And at the forest level, we have some opportunity to delineate or determine desired conditions and restoration objectives. We have a number of mechanisms to accomplish this that include, more active reforestation techniques, sort of monopolizing on the benefits of natural regeneration, as well as in some land allocations, such as wilderness, we basically allow for natural recovery. But I would offer that a post-fire strategy would likely consist of tactics which implement all of those mechanisms, almost sort of like a mutual fund portfolio that balances returns and risks and ecological and administrative appropriateness. And I think one thing that really drives what we're charged to do with on federal ground is remembering that this is all objective driven, and the objectives oftentimes on federal ground can be very diverse. Here is just a very generalized, simplified hypothetical example wherein oftentimes in a fire where we have low severities, we often would identify that we may not even have any reforestation need. However, in maybe areas where there's moderate severity, we have more variable reduction in stocking, more variable survival of our overstory seed tree species, that we might do more aggressive or effective techniques like site prep for natural regeneration or certification of natural regen. And then, of course, when we get into high severity areas, we're doing more intensive techniques such as active reforestation, site prep, planting, release. So I sort of say start planning this, or start planning before you see this. And half of it's tongue-in-cheek, and actually I'd say most of it's serious. Even today, it's always good to keep a good handle on your seed bank inventory and be planning ahead of time of what will be our response if we do have a big fire season, and how are we going to plan for that, budget for it, and implement it. So it's never too early to start planning. Because typically the reality is these circumstances are unfortunate, unplanned, and immediate, and they demand an immediate reactionary response. The word triage sometimes comes to mind depending on scale and your available resources and budgets. One thing that is particularly unique to federal land is that we have to follow the NEPA process. And as many of you may well know, there is very diverse public opinion about reforesting sites post-fire and diverse public opinion about the use of herbicides, as well as salvage harvesting. That all adds to the complexity of managing post-fire environments. And so these circumstances and challenges can be very variable. So really each fire sort of demands its own unique response given that point in time. And as Bob laid out really well, that these landscapes are very dynamic and variable. So each fire demands that site-specific approach. And so what may work for one project in one moment in time may or may not pertain to another site. And so I think that lends to having, when you're managing for multiple objectives, these restoration approaches that employ very diverse strategies and tactics depending on site-specific variables would best balance your risk and return. So before I dive into some examples, I thought I'd go through sort of a few, but as I say here, certainly not comprehensive, both silvicultural and just logistical considerations for planning and implementing a big post-fire reforestation project. The first and probably the no-brainer is both size, scale, and timelines, what you're looking at. As you can see, the fire on the very left side of your screen is a pretty small fire with higher proportions of higher severity. The middle fires are much larger fires with very large proportions of high severity, whereas the fire on the right side of your screen may be a large fire, but does not have nearly as much high severity as the other fires. So each fire would demand a different tactic or strategy. And I should also mention that temporal, your timelines, and I know Bob mentions this as well, and not only your timelines in dealing with that fire, but everything that's else that's going on your piece of ground that you're managing also demands your time and is on a timeline. So there are opportunities and there are opportunities cost to everything. And balancing all of those, I think, is sort of the hardest part of reacting to these post-fire environments. I was asked to sort of touch on salvage harvests. As you know, this can be somewhat controversial on federal lands, and that part of the planning process has a great bearing on our post-fire reforestation. And so you'll see I've said timing, and the coordination of those activities can be complex, but it's absolutely critical, particularly considering where we have longer planning time frames when you're preparing, say, a large EIS, and yet you need to order your seed and sow for your trees a year or two in advance. There are some things that need to be considered in that salvage harvest planning and implementation, such as what your treatment of slash is going to be, what your treatment of submersible material is going to be, and whether or not those treatments will beg for a need for site prep or not. Site quality is also, depending on your size and scale, site quality may serve as a great prioritization of sites for timely reforestation and balancing that risk and return. Higher quality sites, they tend towards higher returns in terms of that survival and growth for us. Lower sites, a little bit more risk. And in some cases, lower sites may be appropriate for natural recovery. You can see in the picture on the left, that is basically a talus slope, but was sustaining a mid-seral forest on it. That would be much tougher for us to reforest, and so some of those areas we've sort of pick and choose our battles, if you will. Another major consideration, I know Bob spoke at length about this, so I'm trying to stay a little bit more general, is that available moisture, seasonality, and access. Basically, we want to be as close to field capacity for root growth to maximize our root growth capacity. That oftentimes plays into part in our seasonality, as Bob spoke, so I'll sort of blast through this. But we very much have to balance that fall versus spring plant. In many of our examples, we've tended towards the spring plant, especially on the east side where that fall season may go directly to snow. Those variable planting windows, if you're dealing with a large-scale project, can be a killer in terms of logistics. And that variable weather always, planting season is always adventuresome with starts and stops. You can see in this photo on the left, we were planting even though there was about, we got a little snow flurry of about an inch of snow on the ground. This was a spring planting. And as Bob brought up as well, snow planting, or snow plowing, and your access to your units is really big. In some areas, we've decided that fall planting was too variable, and so we did make the investment in snow plowing. In other areas, we felt like the snow plowing costs were too much, and so we made the gambles on whether or not we could pull off that fall plant. Walk-in units are another sort of tricky thing that needs to be worked out beforehand, particularly when you're looking at large landscapes with unforgivable terrain and poor or little to no road access. I will try to touch on that later. I'm glad to see Bob and I were tracking along in our themes, especially with site prep and the reburn potential. We are very concerned about creating hospitable fuel environments for our planted trees, and this needs to be balanced with providing for effective soil cover, which is particularly important in the few first years after the fire, as well as managing those long-term fuel loads and providing for large woody retention on your site. You can see there's two photos here. On the left, there is a tree planted in the middle of some red slash. Not quite the most hospitable environment for that tree seedling in the short term. And off to the left, off to the right, you can see a site where we decided we would like to make the investment in site prep, where we've fallen some snags and piled them. In the foreground, below that red line, those areas have not yet been piled, so you can sort of see the difference in fuel loading. Of course, the major consideration is whether natural regeneration on your site is sufficient with a local seed source of your desired species, and if that seed source is providing appropriate stocking of your desired species. Oftentimes I will be discussing artificial planting areas where, like I mentioned with the big smoke plume, it's never too early to start looking at your seed bank inventory. We basically do this every year to look where our holes are of our desired species and our elevations, and make sure that we have a suitable seed bank to meet our needs if the need be. I have down here, can the nurseries produce the quantity? I've run in to certain years where we've actually had to go to 3 separate nurseries in order to meet our seedling order. Those are particularly big years, and that had a big bearing on whether or not we went with bare root or container stock. I would say typically in our smaller plantings, we typically like to plant container stock if need be, but in larger fires where we really needed a lot of trees, we did have to throw some bare root into the mix. And we typically do that on a given year. Competing vegetation and follow-up timber stand improvement. As you all know, these are very variable and dynamic conditions post-fire. It's also dependent on your objectives in terms of release for survival and release for growth, and whether or not you'll be planning to do a pre-commercial thin, as well as that future fuel environment that we've all talked about. I know both John and Joe talked about this at length as well. One thing that is probably maybe interesting to a lot of folks is this chemical versus manual versus mechanical methods to manage competing vegetation. And you can see that I've sort of laid out planning versus implementation costs. As I mentioned before, use of herbicides oftentimes becomes a controversial subject on Forest Service lands. It can drive a more costlier and longer planning environment for us. And so there are both pros and cons to that, as well as opportunities and costs in terms of our limited budget and where we're putting our ID teams and folks. So that is a that is a tough subject and much debated in ID teams and planning meetings, and it just depends on the fire that you're working on. And lastly, timing and safety, particularly if you're working in post-fire environments where you're not doing salvage logging, which I will talk about today. I have to, of course, give the nod to climate change as a consideration. As I said, simply put, these trees that we're planting are long-lived organisms, and the uncertainty about some of their long-term survival lies in climate change. Now, there are some strategies that we've been adopting into our plantings to add some resilience to these treatments, and that includes planting diverse species, utilizing our tree improvement programs that I have to give a nod to, Superior Trees, our seed orchards, looking at assisted migration, and allowing for some creative transfer of seed stock between elevations and seed zones. Much like what Bob talked about, we are sometimes transferring seed between seed zones if the locality of the planting is close to the locality of some of those seed trees, as well as utilizing that resilience of sprouting tree species on the site. For us in the Sierra Mix conifer, that would be black oak, and we're doing similar treatments where we're trying to improve the growth of a single stem black oak. And lastly, investing in managing these fuel loads over time, both around and within those existing plantations. One thing that we found, and this is probably more logistical, is gauging our workforce and infrastructure capacity. We've had instances on our forest, for the long time, the most the plumas planted in a year was about 600 acres. And then we had some fire events where we were asked to plant as much as 12,000 acres a year for a number of years in a row. And that certainly tested both our workforce and our infrastructural capacity to upsize that quickly. Fortunately, in Northern California, we have a great contractor pool, but trying to get enough foresters and inspectors available for those longer planting windows, and as well as getting the logistical support of folks to coordinate, having a truck from the nursery coming in every 2 days for 3 or 4 weeks poses some infrastructure challenges. We've had some cases where we actually had to build a new tree cooler to be able to assume all of that seedling stock close enough to our planting sites. I really have to give a nod to safety here as a big consideration, particularly if you are considering planting an area where you aren't doing any salvage or site prep. And as time goes on, deterioration happens. So in these environments, there is an abundance of snag hazards. And these hazards, you have to realize these trees fail both in entirety but also in portions over time. You can see the tree to the left has I'm going to try the pointer mechanism here. The tree to the left has a big pile of branches that it's shed after that fire. This tree to the right, of course, a good widowmaker ready to fail, especially with a wind load on it. So developing during your planning process a safety and communication plan and an evacuation plan is really critical, not only for your own personnel, but our contracting personnel. And you really want to be prepared before planting season. It's a good idea to have your evacuation routes and helicopter landings mapped out and your field personnel briefed on this before planting season starts. Where possible, I'd prefer to abate those hazards. Where we can't abate all the hazards, we can mitigate exposure. And we've done so with a good safety plan, as well as we've had seasons where we order spot weather forecasts every day for our planting locations, so our contracting personnel can be apprised of what their local weather will be on that site, as well as monitoring the wind over time, especially during the day as those diurnal winds pick up. Getting an early start, as the planting crews typically like to do, is great because it naturally sort of abates that wind. If you can be out of the woods by that 2 or 3 when the wind picks up, that's great. I especially have to give a nod to partnerships. We found over the last decade there have been more and more partners willing to help support reforestation efforts. The National Forest Foundation, American Forests, Arbor Day Foundation, Penny Pines. Our local school district has also been involved, and all of these groups are great to help provide and enhance both public participation, education, and outreach in reforestation efforts on public lands. It can also help offset the cost of seedling stock. And I found that working with school kids in particular is a great way to culture interest in natural resource management in the next generation. I also would like to sort of call out the National Forest Foundation in particular has a program where they're really interested in carbon demonstration plantations. I think that's an interesting program that we've participated in and will be invaluable to reforestation efforts on public lands. Okay, into the fires, or into some field examples. Here I have a map of both the 2001 Stream Fire and the 2006 Boulder Complex Fire, both on the east side of the Sierra Nevada, more east side pine transitioning into a dry Sierra mixed conifer forest. Both fires about 3,000 acres, both 5 years apart, burned in approximately July, so in the heart of our fire season. And they're both within the Antelope Lake Recreation Area. This is an area that gets a lot of visitor use, particularly during our summer season between Memorial Day and Labor Day. So that had some bearing on our objectives in these areas. The Stream Fire was more of a, I would say, more of a conventional salvage harvest plant thereafter. It was salvage harvested 2 years after the fire. That's because the forest had to prepare an EIS that took 2 years to get through the planning process. The harvest occurred with biomass removal, so we were able to get some site preparation out of that. And we, at the time, planted only the salvaged areas, more in a conventional square-spaced planting design with typically more higher stocking levels, closer to the 400, 435 trees per acre. You can see the density of those trees coming in now. However, we haven't done any PCT. Actually, I will go back. We haven't done any PCT PCT or release on either site, and you can see we've gotten some variable results. This picture shows pretty much all trees, very little brush, and you can see this site was aggressively colonized by Ceanothus species, and there are trees in there, but they are competing heavily with that Ceanothus. Here's a picture of an overhead picture of the Boulder Fire in 2006 that burned 5 years later just on the other side of the site. We also planned this for salvage harvest and planting. However, after some experiences on the stream fire, we found that some of those steeper slopes were less economical to harvest given the market. And so we decided to take a strong look at where we were going to focus our more intensive treatments. Particularly, this area encompassed the more heavily used part of the recreation area. So on the picture on the right, the red dotted line is the Boulder Fire in total, but the yellow polygon that you see is the area that got the most use and actually burned with some of the most severity. You can see a lot of that severity down on that peninsula. And so both safety to the public, aesthetics, habitat, we have some nesting bald eagle pairs on this lake, as well as timing and getting our forest products out was some major considerations on this fire. We were able to harvest this the winter after the fire burned, and we were able to achieve some site prep through that biomass removal and some chipping and broadcasting on that site. So there are a few pictures of what that site looks like post-harvest, as well as some of those large down woody debris levels you can see off to the picture of the right. Now this is an ecologically drier site, tends more towards the east side pine with some dry mixed conifer. In this we utilized a wide space cluster design to sort of emphasize heterogeneity. It was certainly a lower density planting. We did plant multiple species, but with an emphasis on the more drought-tolerant pine species. And this was container stock that was planted with augers and hodads. You can see there's that three tree cluster design that we've planted here. And here are sort of the mechanics. You know, we sort of knew going into this that on this dry site, we might have some variable mortality, and we were trying to think of how we might mimic the occurrence of a more naturally appearing forest, particularly within that recreation area. So in this very simple example, this tree in this cluster, say, dies. Maybe 2 trees die in the second cluster. Maybe all the trees die in this third cluster, but in the fourth cluster, all of the trees die, or all of the trees survive, pardon me. And in doing so, we get a little bit more heterogeneity in the establishment and the distribution of those trees, as well as allow for some natural regeneration. So in some of these sites, you can see we've got some great growth. The picture on the left is that spring 2007 planting shown in 2013, so 6 years later. You can also see on that site, though, that sort of variable distribution of planted trees. So this sort of, the thinking is this allows for more growing space for natural regeneration. You can see in the area, let me see if this pointer will work, I guess not. In the sort of the background, you can see we have a great local seed source that we wanted to monopolize on. Oh, thank you. In here, that's our seed source, as well as some variable snag retention. And on this site, since it was a lower density planting, we have not made any follow-up release or PCT investments so far. Also on this site, we planted some aspen in those riparian areas. That was part of adding some heterogeneity to our planting mix. Now this is the 2007 Antelopes Complex fire. You can see that it burned immediately adjacent to the boulder and the stream fire. This was a big fire season for us. This portion is the Antelope Complex fire in this area here. Our driving objective, we knew that the scale was way beyond what we've seen before, at least on our forest. We knew we didn't have a whole lot of seed source out there, and we knew that the timing with the competing vegetation was going to be critical. I've called Mike Landrum the Paul Revere of competing vegetation, because he came to the forest and really asked us to try to up our reforestation program far beyond the comfort level at the time, or what we've done historically. And so our driving objectives here was more triage, to get as many trees planted across as large of a land base as possible, not necessarily to maximize fiber production, but to establish a future seed source of desired species across the landscape. And so we were tasked with planting over 22,000 acres in about 4 years. Our first year post-fire, we really focused on areas that would not be included in a salvage proposal. High severity areas, no salvage or site prep. And we employed both a cluster and a conventional spaced planting design, typically lower densities, but each site received a variable density planting. These sites were manually grub released the following, the summer after planting. This is that first year's planting shown 5 years later in 2013. You can see there is that cluster where all 3 trees survived. Here's an example of the fuel dynamics, however, in those unsalvaged areas. Again, there are your 3 trees, and you can see one of those trees has been somewhat hindered and crushed by falling debris. You can see on this site we have brush species, grass species. So over time, we are looking at opportunities to get in here. Fortunately, with the wide space cluster planting and the trees being large enough, we believe we have some opportunities to get in here and treat some of these fuels mechanically. The second and third years after the fire, we continued planting both all high severity areas primarily, some areas without salvage, some areas that were partially salvaged. Most of the areas did not have biomass removal, so we didn't have that site prep of submersible material, but we did plant multiple species, as many as 5 species on a site. We definitely had variable competing vegetation starting to come in the second year and more so the third year. And so most of our release was all manual grubbing. Again, this is a plantation 3 years after planting with that manual release treatment. And some areas that were not released, the arrows showing the locations of those trees. As I mentioned, that second year, the competing vegetation was highly variable. Both photos are from the same year. On the left side, not a whole lot of competing vegetation. On the right side, competing vegetation becoming well established. The third year in particular, you can see there's a lot of tobacco brush, the Ceanothus velutinus coming in on this site, particularly on north and east facing slopes in the antelope complex fire. And so as our time since the fire increased, we were increasing our scalp sizes and our manual grubbing needs. And here's a photo of that manual release treatment after it first occurred. You can see here are the 3 trees, and all of the vegetation within 5 feet of the planted trees were grubbed below the root collar. On some of these sites, depending on where you have natural regen, we'd like to monopolize on that, particularly with serotinous species, whether it be lodgepole or in this case, this is a Baker cypress stand. All of that vegetation underneath is sprouting tree species. So we're trying to monopolize on that as well as provide for cultural opportunities to improve the growth of those trees. I'd like to talk a little bit about the 2000 story and 2012 CHIPS fires. I think it offers a really interesting story to be told about reburn potential. This is the story fire on the left. You can see that the snags that the arrows are pointing at are the same snags both after the story fire and then after the CHIPS fire that reburned part of the story fire. So where we were getting suitable natural regen is certainly vulnerable to reburn potential. Those 2 snags are similar as well. So this is a site where we were getting some really nice conifer natural regen, as well as some black oak regen, and we had a nice founder stand that was providing a local seed source. After the CHIPS fire burned, however, much of that was lost, and you can see we even incurred some mortality in our local seed source. This is one of these sites that is a 3-hour hike in. So this is where we're trying to get a little bit more creative and are hoping to pull off a helicopter planting where we'll helicopter the seedlings in and hike the planting crews in and try to get this site reforested. On the CHIPS fire, in particular outside the story fire, you can see it was a very different fire, although it was large. It had smaller areas of high severity, at least in terms of proportion. And we included sort of planting both unsalvaged and salvaged areas and are proposing a follow-up grubbing. And you can see here a lot of that area didn't even incur a reforestation need. However, some areas certainly did. Here is a site that we were able to, this fire burned in the summer of 2012. We were able to salvage harvest in the fall of 2013. However, due to market conditions, there was no biomass removal. It's a very high quality site. We have a lot of stems left per acre. And so we are looking at site prepping as much as almost 1,000 acres this next summer for planting. You can see on these sites we do have some heavy fuel loads. So we'll be doing some mechanical site prep with grapple piling, while maintaining both an effective soil cover and providing large down woody debris in ecologically appropriate amounts. Here is an old plantation that burned. It was not salvage harvested, but we decided to site prep it. And you can see we have variable retention of some large down woody debris. Since this was primarily plantation beforehand, we didn't have a lot of large logs, so it was certainly a challenge to, we wanted to maintain whatever large log debris we had on the site. Most of it was small diameter material. We'll be planting this site in this spring of 2014 with a follow-up manual release. Okay, it looks like I'm coming up to the witching hour, so a few just general ending thoughts. Like I said, each fire is unique, and so I don't feel like I could offer a recipe or a silver bullet to address reforesting these dynamic sites. And depending on where you are, you're going to have your own logistical challenges and concerns with timelines, both in terms of planning and implementation and what resources you have available to you. So each plan should be different and should be tailored to meet your specific goals and objectives. However, I'd say within all of those examples, there's a lot of opportunities and challenges that, at least what I've presented, for continued reforestation. So this isn't the end of the story. The buck doesn't end here. These are dynamic long-term projects that are going to demand monitoring and adaptive management over time, particularly with some of the constraints that we're operating under. Some general themes, however, that we've sort of noticed as if we can plant as soon as possible, we can maximize our seedling survival and success. And as that time progresses after the fire, expect and plan for costlier and more intensive treatments. I think I heard Bob say that as well. We are really interested in creating hospitable fuel environments for the trees we plant. We know reburn will happen, and so investment in the site prep is as reasonable as investing in reforestation. But that also includes restoring appropriate fuel loads. That's not just cleaning off the site. And we found that employing different tactics in different areas have helped us balance that risk and return on our investment, and that those partnerships have been invaluable to us in this process. I had to give a few acknowledgments of a lot of folks in the field, and especially at the region, our partners, and I wouldn't want to miss our reforestation and TSI contractors that are really doing the heavy lifting in these projects. And so with that, I think my clock shows 1 o'clock, and I don't want to keep folks from lunch. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, you can't get out that easily, Ryan. Maybe some people. We haven't lost even one participant through both of these presentations. So either they're trap happy. Oh, we just lost one. Either they're trap happy, or they're not hungry, or maybe they've already got their lunch. Let's have a couple of questions here. There was one from Brent about describing a manual release treatment. I think you described that with your with the grubbing, basically with the HODAD, right?
Yeah, we're basically we're doing a manual grubbing release, and we're trying to take everything down under the root collar. We do leave some of that material to provide some dead shade, especially for the Doug fir in some of those areas. In some areas where the brush is too established, if there's a nice established root wad, we're basically trying to knock it back as far as possible. So there are limitations when you're constrained to manual release.
Don Gasser, who, I'm sort of amazed, there he is. He's asking, has any plantation planted by anyone ever made it full term to harvest?
Well, I have to answer Don's question because he convinced me to become a forestry major years ago, maybe 20 years ago. Yes, actually a place that I really enjoy returning to is the Shao plantation on the McLeod district of the Shasta T. A great example of what plantation forestry can look like, years later, or decades later, lifetimes later. Yeah, I think it was first established, I want to say, in the 30s or 40s. An amazing site, and I would encourage a lot of people to go there for some inspiration.
That brings me to a point, Ryan, which maybe we'll close today with, and I really appreciate your presentation, but I want to get in a suggestion to people, to the participants. We want to set up some field trips in association with this webinar that would happen during the summer.